The cold showed no mercy, neither the land, nor the sky, nor the men. Rhea Crow hung by her arms, wrists bound to the twisted trunk of a dead cottonwood tree. Her body trembled, but not from fear. She'd already crossed that threshold. She trembled because the dawn was falling like a sentence over the Colorado highlands, and the ice seeped through her pores like it meant to stay inside her forever. Her bare feet barely touched the frozen earth. Snow crusted beneath her heels. But she felt nothing. Not the sting of open wounds on her knees, not the metallic taste of dried blood on her lips. Only the weight of silence and the cruel pull of the ropes that forced her to remain open, exposed, broken. They had called her witch, Indian plague, traitor to God. 5 men tied her with hemp rope and left her there, suspended between white sky and shattered land, as if her mere existence were a sin. Before they rode off, one of them spat on the ground. Another laughed. A third yanked the veil from her head, letting the wind loose her hair like it was just another thing to throw away. "That's what you get for healing someone you shouldn't have," one muttered before climbing on his horse and fading into the gray of dawn. Rhea didn't answer. She couldn't. Her tongue had swollen inside her mouth like a stone. She tried to pray, but no words came. Not in Apache, not in Spanish, not in Latin. That's when she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not the kind that bring death. This one was slow, heavy, almost thoughtful. A lone horse climbing the ridge with steady resolve. A strong sorrel, muscles weathered by winter and hunger. And on its back, a man. Zeke Callahan. The coat slung over his shoulders was old hide, stained with smoke and snow. His boots sank into the snow up to the ankle. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look surprised. His eyes were like a frozen lake, blue, unmoving. When he looked up and saw her hanging from the tree, his face didn't change. He only frowned, like a man who's seen worse, like a man who's caused worse. Zeke dismounted, slowly, like someone who'd long since learned that speed gets you killed. He walked toward her. Rhea didn't know him, but in her pain, every face was an enemy. When he crouched to untie something from his belt, she rasped the only voice she had left. "You gonna put it in?" she said hoarsely, more accusation than question. Zeke froze. He said nothing. The silence between them stretched longer than minutes. Then he pulled out what he had in his hands. A knife. Small. Bone-handled. "No, girl," he said quietly. "I'm gonna cut you down." And he did. One rope, then the other. The fibers snapped with a dry sound, and Rhea's body dropped like a ragged sack. But it never hit the ground. Zeke caught her in mid-air, firmly, without fumbling. He held her against his chest, like she was something fragile that still deserved warmth. She wept without tears. Her body shut down. The world spun. And she passed out. Up on the ridge, hidden among the trees, someone else was watching. Judd Sloan, the young deputy, had seen it all. From the first flicker in Zeke's eyes to the moment he cradled the woman in his arms. Judd was only 24. Half Mexican, half white. He knew what it felt like to be looked at like half a person. His mother hadn't died of sickness. She'd died of sadness. He watched Zeke load the woman onto the horse and ride off. And he knew, if he spoke of what he'd seen, Creed Malloy's men would come. And this time, they'd finish the job. Judd turned his horse and spurred it toward town. He knew he was about to betray his conscience, but he still didn't know which side of the rope held the real sin. The horse snorted as it reached the cabin's threshold, shaking snow from its mane. Zeke Callahan dismounted without a word. His boots crushed the snow like there was no faith left in the trail. In his arms, Rhea Crow's body lay limp, wrapped in a ragged blanket that smelled of dried blood and old wood smoke. The cabin stood alone in the middle of the clearing, built from thick, rough logs, like everything that still held on in these mountains. No fences, no garden, just a frozen bucket by the door and an oil lamp hanging crooked. Zeke pushed the door open with his shoulder. A dull creak announced his arrival into a space where only the past seemed to live. He laid Rhea down on a bed covered in deer hides. The sagging mattress smelled of damp and time standing still. There was no tenderness in his hands, but there was no violence either. Just the cold touch of a man who'd already lost everything. He threw more wood onto the fire. The glow brought shadows dancing across the walls. In one corner, a broken wooden toy. In another, a crooked crucifix over the window. Zeke rummaged through a cabinet and pulled out a leather pouch. He opened it with rough fingers and took out a small jar. Bear grease mixed with pine resin and mountain herbs. A recipe taught to him by an old Apache he'd once saved. Or maybe killed. He couldn't quite remember. Everything in his past was covered in fog and gunpowder. He knelt beside Rhea. Her face, though blackened by dust and cold, still held a tense, steady beauty, one that wasn't made to please. Her jaw was sharp, and on her closed eyelids still trembled the aftershock of pain. He cleaned her arms with a damp cloth. She whimpered in her sleep. Zeke muttered without looking at her. "It ain't much, but it'll keep you breathing." He applied the salve to her wounds with clumsy care. Then he wrapped her wrists in clean cloth. He watched her for a moment. Not with desire. Not with pity. With the hollow look of a man who's seen death so many times, he no longer knows its name. Rhea opened her eyes later that night. The fire crackled softly. The warmth slowly brought feeling back into her limbs. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't respond. She heard a sound. Zeke was across the cabin, cleaning a long rifle with an old rag. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Somewhere they won't kill you tonight," he replied without looking up. She swallowed. Her throat made it hard to speak. "Why'd you help me?" Zeke leaned the rifle against the wall and sat in a chair near the fire. He took his time answering. When he did, his voice sounded like gravel dragged through wind. "Because I don't want any more ghosts." Rhea studied him. That hardened profile, the scarred hands, the eyes that spoke of once having loved and lost. "What's your name?" "Zeke. Is that a name or a sentence?" He smiled, barely, a sad twitch of the lips. "Depends who says it." Silence. "And you?" Rhea Crow." "Apache name." She nodded. "My mother died giving it to me. My father was killed by miners. Nuns raised me, until the same ones who fed me handed me over to Creed Malloy." Zeke asked nothing more. He stood up and poured a bit of broth into a metal cup. "Drink. We'll need to move tomorrow." "Where to?" "Where they won't find us. Yet." She drank. The liquid burned her throat. But for the first time in days, she wasn't afraid. Zeke handed her a thicker blanket. "Sleep. I won't promise everything'll be all right, but no one's gonna hang you here." Rhea closed her eyes. She didn't dream. She just breathed. And in the frozen night of Colorado, in a forgotten cabin, two broken souls shared something stronger than hope. Silence. Would you like me to continue with part 3? Or do you prefer I write a version for video narration, your YouTube, or cinematic image prompts? I'm ready to move forward. Judd Sloan rode downhill like he had gunpowder on his heels. The sun had just begun to lick the mountain peaks, and the fog still clung to the pines like a cursed secret. The young deputy couldn't stop replaying what he'd seen. An Apache woman, strung up like a human scarecrow, rescued by a man everyone thought was dead inside, Zeke Callahan. That name still echoed heavy in the ears of Silver Point. Ex-soldier, widower, killer, the man who, after losing his wife and son in a fire of uncertain cause, walked away from the world and vanished into the mountains without looking back. And now, 12 years later, he'd saved a woman marked for death. Judd stopped in front of the sheriff's office. Dust rose around his horse like even the land had something to say. Boone Taggart, the sheriff of Silver Point, stood waiting on the porch, hat tilted, and an unlit cigar resting at the corner of his mouth. "Well?" Boone grunted, lifting his left brow. Judd dismounted slowly. He looked at the ground, then at the horizon. "They hung her. But she didn't die." "What the hell are you saying, boy?" "Callahan found her, cut her down, took her with him." Boone spat on the ground. "You telling me Zeke Callahan's hiding that witch Apache girl?" Judd didn't answer. The sheriff took his silence as confirmation. "Damn it, this is going to get ugly." In a white two-story house, with lace curtains and a rocking chair that never stopped creaking, Creed Malloy read a telegram with a furrowed brow. He was a businessman, with land, cattle, and friends wearing silver stars. His wife, Willa Maddox, sat quietly sewing in the corner. Years ago, she had been the most desired flower in the county. Now she was a shadow that moved between threads and secrets. Creed placed the telegram on the table. "Rhea Crow is still alive." Willa didn't look up, but the faint tremble of her fingers betrayed her. "Who says so?" "Judd Sloan. Says Callahan picked her up." "And what are you going to do?" "What's expected of me." "What they expect, or what you want." Creed didn't answer. He stepped out onto the porch and called his men. Within minutes, a group of 20 gathered, some with rifles, others with half-empty bottles of whiskey, all with the same command. Finish the witch and the man protecting her. Far away, high up in the mountains, Zeke was chopping wood. The axe came down with precision, as if it were splitting more than timber. Rage, silence, guilt. Rhea watched from the doorway, still weak, but with eyes steadier than the day before. "Do you always live like this?" she asked. "Like what?" "Like the world already ended." Zeke set the axe down, wiped sweat from his brow with his forearm. "For me it did, long ago." "Then why did you save me?" He didn't answer right away, because you haven't ended yours yet. While Zeke was teaching Rhea how to start a fire without matches, the crows were descending into the valley. Dragged by guilt, Judd made his way to the old church that night. In the shadows, Creed Voss, the elder Apache leader and former ranger, was waiting for him. "You're late, boy," said Creed, leaning on his oak cane. "I didn't know who else to turn to." "Do you still remember what truth smells like?" Judd lowered his head. "They're coming for them, all of them. The sheriff, Creed Malloy, and Zeke has no idea." Creed stayed silent for a moment, then turned toward the altar. "Well then, maybe it's time an old Indian remembers how to fight for something worth keeping." The sun dragged itself behind the peaks like a worn-out beast. Rhea Crow sat on the split log that served as a bench outside the cabin, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her eyes fixed on her bandaged hands. Zeke Callahan set down a bowl of warm water and a piece of toasted bread beside her. Then, without saying a word, He rolled up his sleeves and went back to sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "Do you always do everything in silence?" she asked, her voice raspy but steady. Zeke looked up for a moment. His face, weathered and square, looked carved from stone. "Words don't scare wolves off," he muttered. Rhea watched him, trying to figure out how this man operated. He wasn't kind. He wasn't warm. But he didn't scare her, and that, to her, already felt like a kind of comfort. "You gonna teach me how to use that?" she asked, nodding toward the knife. Zeke tilted his head. "If you don't want to die this week, yeah." First came the knife, then the rope. After that, fire. Zeke showed her how to carve a rabbit snare using 2 forked branches. Rhea learned fast, as if each motion was an act of revenge against the ones who had tied her to that tree. When she messed up, she cursed in Apache. When she got it right, she didn't smile. She just nodded, like he did. At night, they shared root soup and silence. Only the crackling fire and distant coyote howls reminded them they were still alive. One afternoon, as Rhea sharpened a makeshift spear, she asked, "Have you always lived alone up here?" Zeke didn't answer right away. "Since the fire took my family." "Was it an accident?" "No, it was war, or what men call war when they really mean revenge." She laid the spear aside. "I was 6 when I saw miners blow my father's head off over a sack of red dirt. Since then, I learned truth doesn't matter when power's in the room." Zeke stared at her. For the first time, his eyes didn't look like ice. They looked tired. "And yet you're still alive. So are you." They looked at each other for a moment, not with tenderness, with something more raw. Respect. On the 3rd day, the first gunshot cracked like dry thunder. Zeke grabbed Rhea's arm and rolled with her behind the fallen log. From the opposite ridge, a bullet pierced the iron pot by the fire. "God damn it!" Zeke spat. "They found us!" Rhea didn't flinch. She grabbed the long rifle Zeke had left her for practice and held it steady. "How many?" "No idea. But they ain't here to shake hands." They ran through the trees. Zeke knew the woods like the back of his hand. She followed without stumbling, like the earth itself was guiding her. They took shelter in a crevice between the rocks. Zeke checked his revolver. Only 4 bullets left. "Can we get out of here?" "No, we'll head down to the river and cross through the canyon. No sane man would do that at night. Luckily, I'm not in my right mind." Rhea smiled for the first time. "Perfect. Neither am I." Hours later, soaked to the waist, clothes clinging to their bodies and fingers numb, they reached a ledge where they could see the valley from above. Lights flickered below. Torches. Men. Dozens of them. Zeke crouched down, cursing under his breath. "Creed Malloy's brought every bastard from town. They're hunting blood." Rhea knelt beside him. There was no fear on her face. Only resolve. "Then tomorrow we start teaching them it won't come easy." Zeke looked at her. She was no longer the woman who had hung from a tree. Now she was someone who could hold a weapon, who could wait, who could stay silent. "Let's go," he said. "It ain't dying time yet." And they vanished into the pines like 2 shadows the forest hadn't yet given up. Snow crunched under boots with every step. No one spoke. No one had to. Creed Malloy marched at the front with his fur coat open, revealing the rusted iron star hanging from his belt. He wasn't the sheriff, but in Silver Point everyone followed his word as if he were. Beside him rode Dax Mercer, a doctor with filthy hands and worse conscience, Boone Taggart, the actual sheriff but absent in every decision, and about 15 more men. Some were ranchers, others drunks with rifles. all wore the same look, not one of justice, but of punishment. "Callahan crossed the river," said Dax, checking prints in the snow. "They're not moving fast. She's weak." "All the more reason to end this tonight," Malloy muttered, eyes fixed ahead. No one replied. Only the wind through the pines and the crackle of torches could be heard. Higher up, hidden between rocks and shadow, Zeke Callahan watched the approach through an old spyglass from his scouting days. It was cracked, but still worked. Next to him, Rhea crouched behind a moss-covered boulder, holding the long rifle Zeke had taught her to load and aim. She wasn't an expert, but her fingers didn't tremble anymore. "How many are coming?" she whispered. "Too many. Do we stay and fight?" Zeke lowered the spyglass, slid it into his coat without rushing. "Not yet. Not here." She nodded. No argument. She trusted him. Zeke's plan was simple. Cut through the narrow stretch of Wolf Ravine, leave behind smoke and snow traps, and buy enough time for the night to become their ally. But his body no longer moved like it used to. A wound on his side had torn back open when he'd carried Rhea the day before. The tight bandage barely held the bleeding. Or the fear. Rhea noticed the wince. She didn't speak. She just eased the pack off his shoulders and carried it herself. "At this rate," she said, "they're teaching me to be a woman and a cowboy all in the same week." Zeke let out a dry chuckle. "If you live through it, you'll be teaching others yourself." Across the valley, Creed Voss, the old Apache chief and Zeke's former war companion, had gathered 3 young men on the southern slope. They weren't many, but they knew how to move without leaving prints. "That girl ain't gonna die hanging like her mother," he said quietly. One of the young men, eyes fierce, asked, "Are we going to fight the white men?" Creed Voss drove his cane into the snow. "No, we're going to show them there's still law left in these trees." After midnight, when the moon got tangled in black branches, the first trap went off. A burst of embers, damp gunpowder, and flaming branches rained down on the pursuers, scattering their horses. Screams, curses, shots fired into the air. Zeke and Rhea used the chaos to slip between the rocks, but a bullet ricocheted close. She turned without thinking, aimed, fired. One of the men dropped backward with a dry scream. Rhea stood frozen, breathing hard. "Was that your first?" Zeke asked, pushing her toward cover. She nodded without looking at him. "Do you regret it?" "No, but I'll remember it." Zeke placed a hand on her shoulder. "That means you're still human." At the top of the ravine, Creed Malloy's men regrouped, covered in soot and snow. Dax Mercer had a shallow cut across his cheek. "He's a damn lunatic," he roared. "He's got us dancing on his ground." Malloy didn't answer. He turned, eyes scanning the horizon. "Callahan's no lunatic. He's a man with nothing left to lose, and those men are the most dangerous kind." By dawn, Zeke and Rhea reached a hidden clearing, where an old hunting cabin stood abandoned. They took shelter there, running on fumes. Zeke collapsed to the floor, bleeding. Rhea covered him with blankets. She removed the soaked bandage and replaced it with one made from her blouse. She touched his face with a steady hand. "You're not dying now, Zeke Callahan." "I've died plenty of times," he whispered. "Well, this ain't your turn." And as the forest outside woke with the crows' morning calls, inside that cabin, a wounded man and a marked woman found at last a moment of truce. The fire barely held on. Just a few embers, a wisp of smoke, and the scent of damp wood. Zeke Callahan lay back on a pile of blankets on the floor of the old cabin. Sweat drenched his brow. His lips were cracked, skin pale as ash. The bandage Rhea had wrapped around him was stained a deep, dark red. She didn't sleep. Couldn't. Sitting beside him, knife in hand, she kept her eyes sharp to every faint creak. Outside, the night stretched like a starving beast. "You still with me?" she whispered. Zeke barely nodded. "Unfortunately, yeah," he muttered hoarsely. "Unfortunate for who?" Rhea replied with a faint, tired smile. Zeke exhaled slowly. He seemed like he wanted to say more, but his throat didn't cooperate. "Don't talk," she said. "Save your strength." But he insisted, locking his gaze with hers. "There's something you need to know, before the sun wipes me clean." She leaned in, worried. "Don't say that." "Listen," Zeke said, his voice as rough as mountain stone. "I was a soldier out on the frontier. For years. I followed orders without thinking. One time they told us an Apache village was hiding weapons. We moved in at dawn. There were children, women, elders." Rhea felt her stomach twist. The knife in her hand slowly lowered to the ground. "What did you do?" Zeke closed his eyes. A tear slid down his cheek. "I shot a woman. She was holding a child. I thought it was a rifle. It wasn't." Silence fell, absolute. Not even the trees dared to move. Rhea swallowed hard. Her throat was dry, her tongue like stone. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I don't want another innocent to die by my hands, or by my silence." She stood up, walked to the door, threw it open. A gust of cold wind whipped into the cabin like a lash. "I came from the womb of an Apache woman, Zeke. I walked through ashes left by soldiers. I learned never to trust anyone wearing boots like yours. But I also learned something else." She turned and looked at him, her eyes burning with a mix of anger and compassion. "The one who kills and regrets it carries more weight than the one who just pulls the trigger." Zeke said nothing. He just closed his eyes. And for the first time in a long while, it wasn't out of exhaustion. At dawn, a figure appeared in the doorway. Creed Voss entered without asking. He wore his long Apache coat down to the ankles and carried the cane as if it were an extension of his judgment. Rhea stood immediately. "How did you find us?" "Wasn't hard. This man smells like guilt from miles away." Zeke opened his eyes. "You come to kill me?" "No," Creed replied. "I came to marry you." Silence fell instantly. "What did you just say?" "I saw what you did, how you defended her, how you bled for her. This young woman needs protection, and you need something that forces you to keep breathing." Rhea narrowed her eyes. "And who gave you the right to decide that?" "No one," said the old man. "But if I don't do it, they'll be back tomorrow. And this time you won't make it out." Zeke tried to sit up. "You're saying a marriage would protect us?" Creed nodded. "There are old laws. Even cowards respect them. If she bears your name, and you bear her scar, no one can say she was your prisoner." Rhea looked down. There was no love, no desire, but something stronger, an alliance. A way to resist when the whole world wanted to see you swinging from a rope. "I accept," she said. Zeke looked at her, forced himself upright despite the pain. "So do I." The old man pulled a leather cord strung with red and black beads. He tied it around their joined wrists, murmured a few words in Apache, then others in Spanish. At the end, he spat on the ground before them. "This is how the circle is sealed. This is how we call the ancestors." Rhea and Zeke didn't kiss. They didn't embrace. They just looked at each other. And for the first time, they weren't alone anymore. The dawn came without color. only gray and frost. Rhea was gathering snow with bare hands to cool Zeke's forehead. The bandage held, but the fever wouldn't break. The wound still pulsed like the mountain was breathing through it. Outside, the wind pushed branches hard against the cabin. The silence was thick. Something was stirring. Something even the crows didn't dare to announce. "We won't be able to stay here much longer," she said, crushing willow bark for a remedy. Zeke muttered softly, "You don't have to say it. My side already knows." He tried to smile, but the effort cracked into a groan. "How much time do you think we have?" Rhea stared at him. "Until the forest gives back what it gave us, or until the men catch up." By mid-morning, a figure moved through the trees. Slow steps, almost solemn. Thorn Pike, the hunter. The one who always showed up late, but never empty-handed. He came alone. No horse. Wearing an old coat coated in dust, and the blank face of a man who's killed more than he's ever loved. He stopped in front of the cabin door and knocked twice with his knuckles. Not hard, like someone calling up a memory. Rhea opened it, knife in hand. "I'm not here for you," he said, unflinching. "I'm here for the bear." She blinked, confused. "What bear?" "The one hunting farther south. Killed 2 men last night. Left tracks crossing this pass." Zeke groaned from inside. "I don't buy it." Thorn shrugged. "You don't have to. But if you stay put, it'll find you before it finds me." By late afternoon, the 3 of them left the cabin. Zeke rode with effort on a mule Thorn had found tied to a fir tree. Rhea walked beside him, rifle slung over her shoulder. Thorn led the way in silence. The forest smelled different. Not like smoke or sap, like meat, like damp rot, like something ancient on the trail. "You sure you're not here to turn us in?" Zeke whispered when Thorn moved a few steps ahead. Rhea shook her head. "That man doesn't work for Malloy. He only works for death. And this time, we're not on his list." They didn't see the bear. They felt it. A snapping branch, the sudden hush of birds. The mule snorted nervously. Zeke looked up just as the beast stepped out from the trees. It was massive, gray, scars across its back and eyes red from hunger. Thorn fired first, missed by inches. The bear charged. Rhea shouted, "Zeke, down!" He threw himself from the mule just as the claws tore through the air. Everything turned to chaos. Gunshots, screams, the snap of bone. The bear reared over Rhea. She aimed straight at its chest. The bullet vanished into thick hide. She fell backward. Zeke crawled across the ground, bleeding again. The bear roared. It was about to fall on him when a final shot, sharp, clean, tore through part of its skull. The beast stumbled, dropped to its front legs, gasped, and died. Thorn lowered the rifle with the calm of a man who had just repaid a debt to the land. "Wasn't the first," he said, "but it'll be the last." That night, in a makeshift cave, the 3 of them shared silence and a piece of smoked meat. Zeke, still weak, murmured, "Why'd you do it?" Thorn didn't look at him. "Because your woman didn't close her eyes." Rhea frowned. "What do you mean?" "Most folks drop their eyes when death shows up. You didn't, and folks who stare it down, they deserve a second bullet." He got up without saying goodbye. Walked into the darkness, alone, like always. Zeke watched him go. "You think we'll ever see him again?" Rhea pressed her hand over her belly without thinking. "No, but I think he left us something worth more than his shadow." The snow had stopped. The sky, still blanketed in gray clouds, breathed a thick silence, as if the whole forest were holding its breath. The cave where Rhea and Zeke had taken refuge smelled of cold smoke and old meat. Thorn had left at first light. No trace, no farewell. Just like men who don't belong anywhere. Rhea stepped out into the clearing. She walked slowly, one hand firm over her belly. Not out of weakness, but from a feeling that had been stirring inside her for days. At first, she thought it was fear. Then she thought it was fever. But that morning, under the soft light of a hidden sun, she understood. "I'm alive," she whispered, "and I'm not alone." She brought both hands to her belly, gently. A strange warmth spread down her back. It wasn't a miracle. It was a burden. A new life inside a woman being hunted. When she returned to the cave, Zeke was awake. His face was paler, his eyes sunken, but he was sitting up on his own. The wound looked closed on the outside, though it still burned from within. "Where were you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Thinking," Rhea said, as she worked on starting a small fire. "About what?" She looked at him, didn't flinch, didn't blink. "About what it means to carry something inside you, when everything outside is trying to kill you." Zeke studied her, understood immediately. "Are you sure?" Rhea nodded. Her gaze didn't waver. "I don't need a doctor to know when life sparks inside. This isn't a wound, Zeke. It's a root." He closed his eyes for a moment, not in rejection, but from the weight of it, from the dizzying burden of unexpected hope. "Mine? I don't know. And maybe it doesn't matter." Silence. "Do you want it?" "I don't know if I can," she answered, "but I'll carry it as far as my legs will take me." That afternoon, they came down from the mountain. Zeke could barely stand, but he insisted on walking. Rhea helped him. This wasn't a stroll. It was a retreat. The forest was no longer a refuge. It was filled with signs, snapped branches, restless horses, footprints that didn't belong to them. They knew Malloy's men would return, with more guns, more hate, and fewer doubts. By dusk, they found an old shed near the frozen creek. That's where they spent the night. Rhea didn't sleep. She brewed a tea from cottonwood bark and watched every shifting shadow outside. Half asleep, Zeke murmured, "You don't have to stay." "I'm not leaving," she said, without raising her voice. "You could still run. Hide with the child. I didn't run when they hung me. I'm not running now." Zeke turned his head. His eyes were wet. Not from pain, but something older. The fear of losing what little he had left. The next day, Creed Voss appeared. He didn't say where he'd come from, didn't explain how he'd found them. But Rhea knew he was part of the forest, that when the wind went quiet, it was his cane that stepped first. "They're getting close," he said flatly. "How many?" "Everyone Malloy can afford, and a few more just looking for payback." "You got a plan?" Creed Voss nodded slowly. "I do, but you ain't gonna like it." Zeke pushed himself upright, wincing. "The things that save us rarely come dressed in comfort." Creed looked at them both. The young woman with fire in her eyes, the man with ashes in his chest. "Then listen close." That night, Rhea couldn't sleep. Zeke snored softly beneath a blanket pulled up to his neck. The shed was still. But inside her, the child's heart, boy or girl, beat like a distant drum. She thought of her mother. How she watched her die simply because she couldn't run. She thought of her father. How he never let himself cry. And she thought of the life inside her. No name, no face, no story yet, but already changing her soul. She crouched and wrote a word in the dirt with her finger. Life. Then she wiped it away. Not out of fear, but because it wasn't time yet. The sky looked like molten lead. Creed Malloy stood on the ridge, reins in hand. From that height, he could see the clearing where Zeke and Rhea were holed up. No walls, just skinny trees and a half-rotted cabin. A last corner of the world for those no longer on the map. Beside him, Dax Mercer lit a cigar. His coat smelled of gunpowder and antiseptic. "We move in at dawn?" he asked, eyes fixed ahead. Malloy didn't answer. His jaw was tight as bowstring. "What if they're already dead? Then we burn what's left and collect the bones." Inside the cabin, the air was tense. Zeke was cleaning his revolver. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from rage held too long. Rhea was sharpening a makeshift spear with her knife. Creed Voss sat near the fire, watching in silence. "We don't have enough bullets," said Zeke. "Then we make the ones we got worth more than lead," Creed replied. "And if that's still not enough?" "No one asks for guarantees on the frontier, just dignity." Rhea spoke up. "What if I turn myself in?" Zeke's head snapped up like he'd been punched in the chest. "No. Maybe then they won't kill you." "That's not what they want, Rhea. They're not after justice. They want a spectacle. They want fear." She swallowed hard, looked at Creed. "What do you think?" The old man leaned on his cane. "When wolves smell weakness, they don't back off. They move in. If you give yourself up, you'll open the way for more bodies hanging after yours." Rhea nodded. She already knew it. She just needed to hear it said out loud. At Malloy's camp, Boone Taggart, the official sheriff of Silver Point, approached his boss with his hat in hand. "I don't like this, Creed. Folks are starting to talk. They say you're crossing lines even the crows won't touch." Malloy looked at him with contempt. "You grown a conscience now?" "No, but I've got memory. And you should too. The girl, she didn't kill your son." Malloy turned slowly. The cigar hanging from his lips looked more like a threat than a habit. "But she was there, and that's enough." Dawn crept in on silent steps. Rhea prepared like she was going to a ceremony. She tied back her hair, wrapped herself in an old shawl, not to look weak, but to remember where she came from. Zeke handed her a small pistol, tucked inside a leather pouch. "In case I don't make it in time," she said nothing, just gripped his hand tightly. No words would have been enough. Creed Voss stepped forward and laid out the plan. "We'll trigger a fallback, 2 shots from the north flank, then fire the creek. That'll buy us some confusion." "And after that?" "After that, pray to whoever still listens." Then something happened that no one expected. A figure appeared down the trail, riding a black horse, moving slow, but unafraid. She wore a light-colored coat, caked in dry mud. It was a woman, Willa Maddox, Creed Malloy's wife. All the men turned. Some raised their rifles. Boone Taggart lowered his immediately. "Mrs. Maddox," he shouted, "stop, this ain't no place for you." She didn't respond, just kept riding. In her right hand, she carried a sealed envelope. At the center fire, she dismounted, walked straight to her husband, and handed it to him without a glance. "Read it." Malloy took the envelope, suspicious, opened it, pulled out a letter written in shaky handwriting. As he read, the color drained from his lips. The paper trembled in his fingers. "What is this?" Dax Mercer whispered. Boone stepped closer, read over his shoulder, swallowed hard. A confession. From the doctor himself. Admits he was the one who killed the boy. By accident. Too much medicine. Cowardice. Willa finally spoke, her voice steady. And I knew. From the start. But I kept quiet. Because I was scared of you. Malloy took a step back. His eyes looked like a man whose ground had been pulled out from under him. Why now? Because if you go through with this, you won't just kill the innocent. You'll kill what's left of you. Out in the clearing, Rhea felt the shift in the air. She didn't know why. But for the first time in a long while, something inside her let go. Zeke looked at her. What is it? She took a deep breath. Something gave in. And then, far off, a crow called. But this time, it wasn't a bad omen. It was a warning fulfilled. Dawn brought no gunfire, only a cold breeze and a silence so thick it seemed to hold the weight of everything left unsaid. Malloy's camp was still there, but unmoving. As if the weight of truth, that letter penned with trembling hand and years of silence, had frozen their rifles in place. Zeke stepped out of the cabin slowly, leaning on a stick of ash wood. His shirt was unbuttoned, his side bandaged, and his eyes calmer than they'd been in many moons. Rhea walked just behind him. She carried no weapons, only a blanket wrapped across her chest, and the steady gaze of someone who's lived more than one life. Willa Maddox waited in the clearing. Boone Taggart stood at her side. Behind them, Creed Voss, old as the hills but still standing, like a tree no axe had ever felled. Is it over? Rhea asked. Willa nodded. Malloy's gone, left alone, didn't say where, but he took the letter with him, and a little less pride in his spine. Zeke pressed his lips together. And the others? Boone answered. Most didn't even know why they were here. Got tired of killing for someone else's grudge. Left before dawn. Creed Voss walked up to them. He stopped in front of Rhea. Your child won't be born among ropes, he said, or blades. She lowered her head, overcome, then looked at Zeke. And us? Where does our part begin? He took a breath, looked at the forest, then the mountains, then her. I don't know, but for the first time, I don't mind not knowing. Days later, atop the mountain, Zeke and Rhea rebuilt part of the cabin the fire hadn't taken. Not to hide, but to begin. They didn't put up strong doors or set traps, just a table, a well, and 2 chairs facing the valley. At night, they didn't talk much. They listened. They watched each other. Sometimes they cooked in silence. Sometimes she sang softly, songs from her Apache childhood. And sometimes, without saying it, they both knew that if anyone ever came back, they wouldn't have to run. When the birth came, it wasn't easy. Rhea screamed like the mountains when they split. Zeke held her hand tight, sweating more than she did. Creed Voss helped however he could. He wasn't a doctor. He was a warrior. But in that moment, his old wisdom did more than any scalpel could. And when at last the newborn's cry broke the air, all of them went still. It was a girl, small, red as clay, strong as blood. Rhea held her close and whispered her name. Aluna. Zeke looked at her, and for the first time, he wept. The seasons passed. No one came looking for them. Rhea's name faded into whispers. Zeke's, too. But in the nearby towns, folks started talking about a cabin up high, where a woman lived with fierce eyes and a man with hands like iron and a heart that had been mended. They said they gave water to any passerby, that they asked no questions, that if someone came wounded, they'd patch him up, and if someone came with hate in their chest, they simply couldn't cross the threshold. The cabin became a legend. Not because it was big, but because something rarer than gold was built there. Peace. One afternoon, while Rhea was gathering firewood and Zeke was teaching the little girl how to lift a stone without crushing the insects beneath, Aluna asked, "Papa, why are we way out here?" Zeke looked at her, thought for a moment, then answered, "Because there are places in this world where pain stays to live, and others where life starts again." Rhea smiled from up on the hill, and there, between pine and sky, the story ended. Or maybe it had only just begun. And you, who've made it this far, do you believe love can rise in the desert, among wounds that still bleed, and silences heavier than words? Or, put another way, how much is something worth when you choose to protect it, even if no one else would? If this story moved you, I invite you to join us for more true tales of the Old West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit God gave those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and ride with us once more across this wild land. Thank you